Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
You really have to cut it to a few highlights, so this will be actually fairly short. Fritz got his PhD in '69 at the University of Illinois, and he's been very active in generative linguistics and the history of generative linguistics for many, many years. Just to point out a few highlights, there's 3 books that are pretty widely read, so you may be familiar with those. There's Linguistic Theory in America, Politics of Linguistics, and Generative Linguistics, a Historical Perspective. Fritz has also been, like many other things, been very active in the LSA. So he was Secretary Treasurer and President of the LSA in the past. He was editor of Natural Language and Linguistic Theory, NLOT, and he's currently acting chair at the Department of Linguistics because Julia Hutchinson is on sabbatical. But I think you were chair for like 10 years.
Unfortunately.
So it's not a
10-year sentence.
role.
Yeah.
And Fritz is also currently Nostrand Professor of Linguistics at the UW.
Thank you, Mike. Is this on now automatically? Or? Yeah. Okay. When I entered the field of linguistics in the mid-1960s, a student had to make a stark choice. Either you were going to do generative grammar, meaning formal syntax or formal phonology, or you had to totally devote yourself to some other field of linguistics, sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, semantics, or whatever. And the typical generative grammarian at that time had absolutely nothing to say to linguists working in these other areas. Maybe they'd encounter each other at the odd faculty meeting and then have nothing to say to each other. Amazingly, this situation of generative grammar being done in almost total isolation lasted at least until the early 1990s. The UW Department of Linguistics was quite typical in that respect. We did nothing but syntax and phonology until around 1985, at which point we hired our first semanticist. And even that semanticist had as her main area of interest how a formal theory of semantics plugged in to a formal theory of syntax. Things have changed incredibly in the last decade. There's vastly more interdisciplinarity, both within the field of linguistics and between linguistics and related fields. As far as field internal things are concerned, the syntactician who pays no attention to meaning, discourse, communicative function, and even sociological variables is becoming rarer and rarer. You could say the same thing about the phonologist who pays no attention to phonetics. In terms of interaction with researchers in other fields, linguistics more and more finds itself housed in a broader cognitive science program. And if you look at the main journals of the field, with each passing year there are more and more co-authored articles where one author is a linguist and the other is a psychologist, a neuroscientist of some sort, philosopher, or a computer scientist. Here's a good example of how the field has changed or in the process of changing. Every other year, the Linguistic Society of America hosts a summer institute. Some of you have even been to them, I think, where students can take courses from prominent linguists from around the world. Next summer's institute is going to be at MIT, Chomsky's home base, and still the epicenter of work in generative grammar. Listen to the names of some of the courses that are going to be offered at MIT, given by the MIT Linguistics Department. Introduction to Laboratory Phonology, Pragmatics in Linguistic Theory, Common Sense Knowledge and Lexical Semantics, Inductive Learning of Rules and Constraints, Language Universals from a Computational Perspective, Statistical Learning and Human Language Acquisition, The Time Course of Language Change, a Corpus-Based Perspective. None of that would have been possible a few years ago. And when you look at some of the changes in the UW Linguistics Department in the last decade, it's parallel. Existing members of the department, like myself, have branched out to study the interaction of functional and formal principles in shaping grammar. And there's more and more questioning of the Chomskyan orthodoxy with respect to the degree of innateness of principles of grammar. We'll come back to the question of innateness late in a few minutes. And when you look at the new hires in the linguistics department, in 1998, we hired 2 experimental phoneticians, one of whom doubles as a sociolinguist. One of the phoneticians and faculty members in the School of Engineering have just gotten a $1 million grant to develop what they call the vocal joystick, voice-based assistive technology for the motor impaired. This year we hired our first computational linguist and have plans to hire 2 more next year. And the 3 will form the teaching and research core of a new professional master's program in computational linguistics that will be launching next year. We've already forged close links with ongoing work at Microsoft. Nobody's kept count, but I think at least a couple dozen of our students and grads have found employment here at one time or other in the last decade, either as student interns or permanent employees. And we have grads from our department working in computational linguistics, NLP, at Boeing, Toshiba, Xerox, and lots of other places. So why these changes? Oh, I have a handout. This is very low tech, but they're the best way to have, if you have lots of data. Wait till you. I think they're enough. Should be. So why have there been these changes, particularly among people who are still devoted generative grammarians, as I am? I think that most everybody has come to realize that you can't do syntax and phonology in a microcosm. There's a lot more going on than grammar narrowly defined. For example, you can't understand why the verb throw passivizes and the verb cost doesn't without studying the thematic, that is, the semantic structure of verbs like throw and cost. So Mary threw the ball was thrown by Mary. The book cost $10, but not $10 was cost by the book. You can't understand why you can extract a noun phrase from the complement of think, but not from the complement of regret, without understanding the information structure properties of the acts of thinking and regretting. So who do you think that John saw, but very rare if possible at all? Who do you regret that John saw? And you can't understand why verb-object languages tend to be prepositional and object-verb languages tend to be postpositional without studying parsing efficiency. So interesting fact about the distribution of languages in the world. About 45% of the world's languages are like English, where the verb comes before the object and the preposition before its object. About 45% of the languages of the world are like Japanese, where the object comes before the verb and the noun before the postposition. And only about 5% are like Finnish, that are verb, object, and noun preposition, and only about 5% like Amharic, which are object, verb, and preposition, noun. There are fairly straightforward principles of processing, parsing by hearers that explain this distribution of the data. Furthermore, virtually everybody now recognizes that language users are highly tuned to the frequency of grammatical elements. This has been appreciated for decades in studies of phonological change. Changes are often diffused through the lexicon, affecting frequently used words first. I can actually give an example from my own not very pure Philadelphia dialect. So look at reflexes of Middle English short O. It's been diphthongized in Philadelphia only in the statistically most frequent words and remains standard American in words that are less common. So I say on and off, but honor, awful, don, doff, and goth. I say dog, but frog, bog, log. Loss and boss, but floss and dross. I say strong, song, wrong, but gong, tong, and King Kong. And cost and frost, but Pentecost. Again, it's the historical explanation, not explanation, but at least the description of what's happened has been discussed by Bill above and other sociolinguists. It's the statistically most frequent words that have undergone this change. So speakers are highly tuned to frequency, which is something that generative grammarians have avoided or denied throughout most of the history of generative grammar. So the debate now, the main debate in linguistics is not over whether linguistic theory should pay attention to thematic structure, information structure, parsing strategies, frequency, and so on, but how it should do so. And broadly speaking, there are two approaches to incorporating these kinds of ideas into linguistic theory, which you could call the modular approach and the non-modular approach, illustrated by the juvenile drawings. So in a modular view of grammar, which of course is the traditional generative approach, we actually have an autonomous, autonomous, a word that has to be hedged very carefully in its usage, grammar box in our head. And within that grammar box, so to speak, there's a separate mental box for syntax. And the way that parsing, information structure, frequency, and are incorporated is through the interaction of these autonomous modules with other systems, cognitive systems, physiological systems involved in language. A non-modular view of grammar is represented by the second figure, where there's no autonomy at all. You could think of PDP models, connectionism, as an extreme version of that, but there are less extreme versions posited by many people in functional and cognitive linguistics that deny any kind of real autonomy to grammar, broadly speaking, or syntax, narrowly speaking. What I'll do in just 5 minutes to give a few arguments in support of a modular view, I'm going to focus on whether the grammar itself should incorporate statistical information derived from corpus-based studies indicating the frequency of occurrence of linguistic constructs. Now, clearly, for some purposes, statistical information can be extremely valuable. Corpora reveal broad typological features of language that any theory of variation and use and so on has to address. And it goes without saying that statistical facts drawn from corpora are essential for engineering applications of linguistics. I would certainly never deny that. But it's a long way from there to the conclusion that corpus-derived statistical information is relevant to the nature of the grammar of any individual speaker. And that's what I'm going to address in the next 5 minutes. And in particular, it's a long way from there to the conclusion that grammars should be constructed with probabilities tied to constructions, constraints, rules, or whatever. So I'll give some arguments against stochastic grammars as models of linguistic competence. In every proposal that I'm aware of, the probabilities are drawn from corpora. Of course, one corpora that's widely applied is derived from the New York Times. But look, no child has ever learned English by being read to from the New York Times. Another is a switchboard corpus, a database of spontaneous telephone conversations by over 500 American English speakers. But the switchboard corpus encompasses conversations from a wide variety of speech communities. So tell me, how could usage facts from a speech community to which I do not belong have any relevance to the nature of my grammar? There's no way that you can draw conclusions about the grammar of an individual from usage facts about communities, particularly communities that the individual receives no speech input from. So there's a lot of non sequiturs in the literature that arise from ignoring this simple fact. So Chris Manning observes that Pollard and Saw consider sentence 5A grammatical, but 5B ungrammatical. We regard Kim as an acceptable candidate, but Pollard and Saw star sentences like we regard Kim to be an acceptable candidate. Chris then produces examples from the New York Times of sentences like 5B. Now, maybe 5B is generated by Pollard's grammar and maybe it isn't. Maybe 5B is generated by Saag's grammar and maybe it isn't. But we'll never find out by reading the New York Times. The point is that we don't have group minds. No input data that an individual did not experience can be relevant to the nature of their grammar. But even when this methodological problem is overcome, the evidence for probabilities being associated with grammatical elements seems pretty weak. The numbers are overwhelmingly epiphenomenal. So take another example from Chris Manning. it's very, you can say, or it's common to say, it's unlikely that the company will be able to meet this year's revenue forecasts, but that the company will be able to meet this year's revenue forecast is unlikely, is much less likely to be said. 6b is much less common, that construction, than 6a. And Manning argues that these facts should be part of our grammars, but it doesn't. It's not true. It's part of our usage of language that for processing reasons, speakers will tend to avoid sentences with heavy subjects. As a consequence, we're more likely to say 6a than 6b. There's no reason to conclude, since there's an independent explanation, that the grammars themselves reveal that likelihood. The probability of using some grammatical element might arise as much from real-world knowledge and behavior as from parsing ease. So Tom Wasso notes that we're much more likely to use the verb walk intransitively than transitively. We're much more likely, in 7a and b, we're much more likely to say Sandy walked or Sandy walked to the store than Sandy walked the dog. And he takes that fact as evidence that stochastic information needs to be associated with subcategorization frames. But to explain the greater frequency of sentence types like of 7a than 7b, all we need to do is observe that walking oneself is a more common activity than walking some other creature. It's not a fact about grammar. Furthermore, since we speak in context, the probability that we'll say whatever varies with that context. An example, Stephen Abney suggests that grammars have weighted probabilities for different parses of the same string. So take the phrase 8, well known in the literature, the shooting of the hunters. It's apparently the case that overwhelmingly in structures of the form the gerund of NP, the NP is interpreted as the object of the gerund, not as the subject. Now that's a raw fact about frequency of interpretation, but our interpretation of a structurally ambiguous string is determined in large part by real-world contextual factors that have nothing to do with grammar, no matter how broadly defined. If somebody says to me, 9, the shooting of the hunters will shock the cruelty to animals people, while we're looking at men with rifles standing in front of piles of bullet-ridden deer, then I would guess that the probability of the subject interpretation of the gerund would jump to 99.9%. We'd still like to know why, in general, that is, without special context, the object reading is more natural than the subject reading. Most likely because we have an alternative means of expressing the subject reading where the preposition's thematic role is explicit, namely 10, the shooting by the hunters. So it seems to me that the most natural treatment is to say that the phrase is grammatically ambiguous and that extra grammatical factors determine which reading is both statistically preferred and likely to be preferred in a given instance. So certainly language users, and hence indirectly their grammars, are sensitive both to pressures that cause frequency differences and to frequency itself. But from the fact that y is sensitive to x, it doesn't follow that x is part of the same system that characterizes y. Stochastic grammar is no more defensible as an approach to language and mind as a theory of vision would be that tries to tell us what we're likely to look at. There's a problem with stochastic approaches to syntax that doesn't arise with analogous approaches to phonology. The choice of phonological variants is purely a social matter. Whether you drop R's at the ends of words has to do with, among other things, your social position in society. But syntactic variants invariably differ, however subtly, in the meaning that they convey. There's very, very few true paraphrases. So viewed from that angle, assigning probabilities to structures or constraints seems especially problematic. The probabilities are more a function of the meaning that we want to convey than of some inherent property of the structure itself. And finally, there's the question of genre. Surely the probability of use of whatever is a function of the particular genre, but there's an indefinite number of genres. Doug Biber has discussed 45 different registers of spoken and written English and says there are many more. Think of all the studies of the differences between the speech of men and women, gays and straights, old people and young people, and so on. Let me give an example of how the multiplicity of genres cuts at the heart of stochastic grammar. The last time I flew, I heard some bizarre but genre-normal syntax and lexicon from the flight crew in 11. Things like, we do request that you remain in your seat until the seatbelt light is turned off, where do support is used for non-negative, non-interrogative sentences. We are ready to depart the gate. please turn off all those electronic devices and stow these devices, never them, until you are further notified. You will be free to move out. You will be free to move about the cabin as required, which is understood as required by you, not as required by the flight crew. And my favorite, F, we hope that you will enjoy your stay in the Seattle area or wherever your destination may take you. It's been a long time since my destination has taken me anywhere. So what do we do with that? I mean, do flight attendants have different stochastic grammars from the rest of us? Only when they're working? Does my grammar change when I'm on an airplane? Surely it's simpler to say that part of one's training in the airline industry is the use of otherwise ungrammatical sentence types. And for someone like me, probably someone like all of us, we've learned to interpret the meaning and appropriate use of such sentence types by appealing to our grammatical resources and world knowledge. Another reason to support a modular view of grammar. And just to conclude, one more reason that I think a modular approach to grammar is right is that there are just facts about grammar that are no more and no less than facts about grammar that cannot be derived from anything broader, that are just somehow the language organ, if you want to call it that, is organized that way. So to give a few examples, it might be useful to catalog some of the things that no language in the world is known to do and where there's no usefulness-based, external-based explanation for the absence of the property. So they're in the second page of the handout. For example, there's no language in the world where words are made up of sequences of sounds where each sound corresponds to a more restricted aspect of the meaning of the word than the preceding sound. So there's no language where names of physical objects, for example, all start with K, names of all animals have an O, names of all mammals have a B, and so on. So the word for raccoon would start K-O-B. What's interesting about this impossibility is that for hundreds of years, many made-up languages have just this property. When people started making up artificial languages in the 17th century, this is what they looked like. Yet no natural language has this property. There's nothing off-the-cuff implausible. They just don't exist. Along the same lines, there's no language in the world where you form a negative or a question or a command or whatever by changing the first sound of the verb. So there's no language where finish your supper would be pinish your supper, where call me tomorrow would be call me tomorrow, and so on. A lot of languages form questions by doing nothing but changing the intonation contour, the pitch of the sentence. So in English, we can question the idea of you're leaving by saying you're leaving. But in no language are negatives formed by changing the intonation contour. So no language has a sentence like you're leaving. That means you are not leaving. There's no language where the syntax can count, or at least where it can count past 2. What do I mean? I mean that we never find languages where, say, you negate an affirmative by sticking in a word like not as the third word of the sentence. In some languages like Spanish, the negative goes pretty regularly before the verb. In other languages like German, the negative goes pretty regularly after the verb and the object. In other languages like French and English, negation is a lot more complex, but we never find negative words being stuck in precisely after the third word or the fourth or the fifth. And that's quite odd. People can count to 3 or 4 or 5 quite easily. Why not their grammars? There's also some amazing gaps in vocabulary across language as well. Most languages have words that translate as all, some, both, none, and so on, but no language has a word that translates as not all. So in no language can you say something like, all the children are here, meaning not all the children are here. Languages don't seem to have words for logical complements in general, that is, words that convey the idea of everything except for something. So we could imagine a language that might have a word g3 that would mean all but 3, g4 that would mean all but 4, g-children meaning all but everybody except the children, and so on. But no language in the world has ever been discovered that has negations of words for negating complements like that. So it's the fact that all of the languages of the world do certain things, even though there's no communicative reason why they should, and the fact that no languages in the world do certain things, even though there's no communicative reason why they shouldn't, that form the meat of grammatical theory in the traditional generative sense, and have led linguists to suggest that the human brain is hardwired for particular grammatical properties. So if there's some respect in which all of the 6,000 or so languages of the world behave in the same way, the identical behavior might simply be a consequence of the fact that all humans are pretty much the same physiologically, and we all share certain needs and experiences. But it might also be a consequence of an innate, function-independent, universal grammar that shapes the grammars of all languages. And I think for this reason, even if we are, as we should be, committed not just to looking at the narrow grammatical facts, but to bringing in facts from everywhere, from frequency to social context, I think there's still good evidence that the traditional generative vision, that of a universal grammar that narrowly defines certain syntactic properties, is correct. Thank you.
Just want to say before we take questions that we also have Donald Summers here from the Office of Development at the UW. He's been instrumental at helping us sort of form some ties from the UW Department of Linguistics to the outside world. And he'll be talking a little bit after the questions. So just make you aware of that. So let's go to the questions.
No, it's been a long time since I've heard arguments like these.
Ah,
Let me not take
I think that I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
No, it's not a good thing. Right. But let me not take on the old ones, which have been debated a long time. I mean, the no languages have this, that, and the other. And, I mean, that cuts both ways. No languages have centering, for example. Really
But there we have a good functional explanation.
Well, I mean, however you want to cut this. I mean, all right. But let's go for some of the pot shots at the New York Times.
Right.
Actually, about a decade ago, I was working with publishers, and in those days, it was really hard to come up with data.
Mm-hmm.
Publishers were the source of the data, and rather than just pay them a lot of money, I wasn't working with Microsoft at the time. Microsoft was giving the publishers far too much money, so I couldn't compete with Microsoft to get data, but we could give the publishers favors in time. And so I was working with them. They had a new thesaurus they were coming out with, and they wanted to add some words to the next edition of the thesaurus. Chapman's Associated Fifth. And first they gave us a bunch of books that they just published, and we looked through those books for words that they didn't have. It's easy to find words in those books that they didn't have. It was very hard to find any words in those books that they didn't have that they wanted. All right, so that they gave us mostly scholarly books. We found that the scholarly books were words that scholars use that no ordinary person would ever use. And then, and what they were looking for was how the language had changed from the to the fifth. So then we started looking at other stuff that we happened to have around, and the AP News was a gold mine. There was tons of stuff in the news that they didn't have and they wanted.
Okay.
And we were able to add 10,000 words to their thesaurus that they didn't have.
Okay.
So where I'm going with this is to say that in fact the news is actually a better corpus of recent changes in the language than almost anything else I've been able to find.
I agree.
And so by saying that the news is, the child doesn't learn the language from reading the news is a bit of a cheap shot, because in fact what the child is learning is probably being exposed to are recent changes in the language. And the news is actually more reflective of that than almost anything else that I can find. And so while it's true they don't actually read the newspaper itself, that is, I think it is a bit of a cheap shot to say that it's not representative. And while I know that most lexicographers in England they take cheap shots as well, most of them have come around. They've actually realized that it's a better reflection of language than the stuff that they were before.
It's a better reflection of the language, if we mean English, the English language in this broad socio-political sense. meaning something that negates the difference among dialects, among idiolects, that reflects some sort of pan-English. It's really, to me, it's quite ironic that of all the sentences that Chomsky has ever penned, that the one that's aroused the most hostility was at the beginning of Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, where he talked about the homogeneous speech. We make this idealization of the homogeneous speech community, the speaker here who has learned their language perfectly, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, sociolinguists, variationists have just lit into him for that. But we're coming back to that by exactly the same sort of people, very often, who 30 years ago were so hostile to the idea of the homogeneous speech community. Because what using the broad corpora that include all different genres, styles, dialects, idiolects does is basically get us back to what we tried to get away from, what sociolinguists tried to get away from so many years ago, the idea of negating individual social, geographical differences among speakers to talk about some sort of pan-English. Now, for some purposes, I mean, again, for engineering purposes of language, of course, that's exactly what you want to do. If what you're interested in is developing some sort of, well, any kind of computer application of language, surely you can abstract away from all those differences. Look at the New York Times. But if you want to know how my grammar is different from yours, or my grammar is different from one where people use double negatives or positive any more sentences, like people who say, I don't go there, or excuse me, I go there anymore, which is quite common in some American dialects. The last thing that you want to do is to look at some sort of broad corpus that includes, that gloms together all of these different speech varieties.
Right. I was just reacting to the earlier point that you made that the New York Times is an inappropriate source for studying acquisition.
Well,
that isn't to say that it's probably, at least the 18 years is down there. It's probably more representative of changes in language than anything else I think has come out. And so while it might seem rather absurd as a model of language, that actually it's probably less absurd than classic literature.
well,
None of these corporate speak to differences that all come from English. I mean, there's some smaller studies,
right.
but they're not going to find out that. You were talking about that earlier. You were just trying to say that, I guess you were suggesting that all the corporate that we have are useless.
The corpora that we have, well, I don't know all the corpora that we have. Some corpora that I've looked at are useless for identifying, for characterizing the linguistic competence of any individual speaker of the language. Yeah, they're great for looking at trends in language development and so on. I mean, that's precisely what they're perfect for. Chris?
Half question on, still in the process of being formulated. This little collection of things, some things that no languages use on the second page. Of these, let's see, 1, 2, at least are morphological
Yeah.
rather than syntactic. I guess where language, where syntax can count would be like this sort of crystallization of Claire, for example, in Latin.
Right. Yeah, second position in syntax is widely used for...
That's
yeah.
second position at a constituent level, not at
Right. Wacker-Nagel's law.
So I'm just looking at these and wondering, okay, to what extent you might